So, but it's fine. So, and I can tell you what you would have seen. So the first slide, you'd see a digital tape. I don't know if anybody remembers digital tapes. Does anyone here remember using digital tapes? Yeah, a couple of you. Okay, but probably not recently. Now, why do I want to talk about digital tapes? Because this is, to me, a really early example of the problem of focusing on the technology to fix a problem that comes up because of technology. So when digital tapes came into existence, the big challenge people were worried about was copyright. After all, earlier technologies for recording and sharing music were analog tapes and so forth. And there was a loss of quality. When someone made you a mixtape and used an analog tape, the music wasn't as high quality as it was if you went to the store and bought a brand new tape. So there was some consequence of copying. That meant that there was, some people did it, copying music was a problem, but the concern was this would become even worse with digital tapes. Why? Because digital tapes could make a perfect copy. Now, for people listening to music today, this is not a very surprising thing. We do digital things, digital music, digital movies, etc., all the time, but it was digital tapes that raised this problem for the mainstream. But what did most jurisdictions do? And I'm including here Australia and the US. I don't actually know Germany. But what most jurisdictions did is that they regulated digital tapes. So in Australia, by way of example, there was a special tax created. So if you went to the store and bought a blank digital tape, you paid a little bit more in tax, and that money was used to distribute it to people who, created music and so forth through the various copyright societies. And in the US, they had a whole additional chapter in their Copyright Act that was just for digital tapes. So very similar kind of approach. The problem with digital tapes, let's do something about digital tapes. Now, why does that kind of thing not work? Because digital tapes aren't the mechanism people are using anymore to do the same thing and cause the same problem. So the whole chapter of the Copyright Act in the US, the various sections about this special tax, which went all the way up to our High Court because there were issues about the legitimacy of the tax, the whole rigmarole, the millions of dollars spent, not only creating the laws, but in Australia, dealing with all of the legal issues related to them, were relevant for only a few years. Because after that, we still had the problem. The laws that regulated digital tapes didn't regulate CD-ROMs and all the different mechanisms we now have for storing digital files. Now, if that was a one-off, fair enough. But I can give you many more examples. So another one is nanomaterials. Now, again, this raised problems. Why? Because you have chemical regulation in most jurisdictions, right? That says, when you bring a new chemical onto the market, you have to test it, assess the risk. Some kind of regulator, et cetera, determines whether you can bring it onto the mass market. But nanomaterials were nano versions of existing chemicals that had different properties. So you could have silver, and silver's fine, but if you have nano silver, the risks are different. But the way chemical regulation was structured, again, in most jurisdictions, particle size wasn't a relevant feature that made it different to the point of requiring different testing and reinitiating the process. Now, in this case, lots of jurisdictions did different things. So in Europe, nanomaterials became regulated, particularly when they were in makeup and in cosmetics and so forth, under a sort of specific section in the EU regulation. In Australia, on the other hand, we fixed what the actual problem was. And the problem was the lack of a need to retest. So the word nanomaterials didn't need to be mentioned. We didn't need to regulate nanomaterials. We just needed to say that particle size made a chemical different so that it needed to go through the process again. It was no longer, nano silver was no longer considered the same chemical as silver and so forth. Now, why does that matter? Are we still happy regulating nanomaterials? Well, we're already at the edges of that because the definition of nanomaterials that was written into the regulation is no longer exactly what it is that means particle size gives something different properties. We now have things outside the original range specified in that legislation that act like nanomaterials with different chemical properties. So the Australian approach works because it's just particle size that creates the need to reinitiate. But if you define nanomaterials and regulate nanomaterials, there are now already under inclusiveness in that new technology specific regulation. And I can go on, but I do want to get to the question of automation, algorithms, and AI. But these are, what I argue, raise exactly the same problems. There are laws already on the books in different jurisdictions that refer to automation, that refer to AI, that refer to algorithms, and that refer to bots. That's a lovely little one in the US. And all of these laws define the specific technology, sometimes narrowly, sometimes broadly, and then regulate on the basis of that technology. So you name something that's causing a problem legally, you define it however you think is appropriate, and then you regulate it. And that is the approach that I'm going to critique. So, okay, the first thing is to say that even though we don't need to regulate something like artificial intelligence, in my argument, we do need to change the law because of artificial intelligence. In other words, these new techniques, the issue is not that they don't raise legal issues. Like digital tapes and like nanomaterials, they absolutely do. The issue is that when we respond to those new issues, we can do so in a way that's not technology specific. So for artificial intelligence, for example, there are many sort of examples that can get given, and I'll come to a few of them later in the talk, that illustrate that they create problems, that we do need to change the law, but that we don't need to change it in a way that mentions the technological practice that gives rise to the concern. So I also wanted to start out by saying the argument has a limit. So there are situations where you do want to do technology-specific regulation. A really good example of that is something like human reproductive cloning, right? And there were lots of laws internationally that very specifically said, if you, in a lab, clone a human being, then that is prohibited, right? And they worded it different ways, but that was very technology specific. It was only when it was done in a lab that the prohibition applied. And there were really good reasons for that. Human cloning happens naturally all the time. If anybody is an identical twin, they have a human clone in the sense of someone with the same genetic material as them who is alive. And when it happens in utero, if you will, in the woman's body, then we don't want to prohibit that. We're not banning identical twins and forcing the slaughter of one of them. We're just saying we don't want you to do that in a laboratory. So technology specific, saying it's the technical process that's the thing we're worried about, and that's what we're prohibiting, was completely appropriate where the goal of the law, right, and the technology are in perfect alignment. So there are exceptions where technology specific laws are appropriate, but I'm arguing that is not the case for artificial intelligence, for automation, for algorithms, for bots, etc. So what I might do next, hold on, is talk a little bit about what I'm arguing then should be done. And now I've even lost my printout of my slide. Give me one second. Okay. Sorry, it fell on the floor when I printed. All right. So how do I argue? What do I argue we should do? And here's where a slide would have been really useful. So you'll have to imagine a 3-step process. Okay. And the first step is to understand your goals and your values, right? What are we worried about here? And this might be privacy. This might be the accountability of certain kinds of decision making. This might be fairness, right? Whatever it is, what are the values and goals? What are the things we're trying to protect? Second step is how well the current laws meet those goals in light of the new technology that we're worried about. So how well can we still achieve accountability in decision making or fairness if we now have these new techniques, given the current legal protections that exist for those values? So if we take, for example, discrimination law, that's our main mechanism of protecting fairness, and most jurisdictions now have laws against certain forms of discrimination. Do those laws work effectively to protect the same value, here fairness, in the context of new ways in which decisions are being made, namely machine learning, artificial intelligence, etc. Now, in that exercise, the best way I think to think about it is scenarios, and these are easy to find. There are plenty of examples in the literature, say about the challenges that machine learning raises for fairness, the challenges that automation raises for accountability, and so forth. So the examples are very, very easy, and they help understand what the challenge is that needs to be solved. But I also have a little bit more of a sort of systematic way of thinking through the problem. And what I do is I think about 4 ways in which current laws can obsolesce, if you like. It's 4 ways in which current laws cannot work anymore, right, to achieve their underlying goals. And they're all a bit different. So the first is just to say there's no current law. The kind of problem that's raised by this technology is very much about the technology. This isn't something we were protecting against before because it didn't happen before. So we never protected for that value. And this is what happened with human cloning, right? So when human reproductive cloning became possible, when we started to be able to do this in the laboratory, the concern was about the technology, right? We didn't have laws that, you know, protected the concern we were worried about with human reproductive cloning because it didn't exist. And we did need to think about something very specific for that scenario. That's the first time. We just don't have laws about this, right? That's not the case with fairness and machine learning. We have discrimination law, right? That's not the case with machine learning and privacy because there's data protection law, right? So we have laws sometimes, but sometimes we go to the cupboard and it's bare. First problem. Second problem, uncertainty. We have laws, but we're not sure how they're going to apply. So in the situation of discrimination law and some of the issues being raised by machine learning, lots of people have looked at their own discrimination acts and say they're not sure how it would apply to prevent the kind of biased decision-making we're seeing come out of machine learning. And that depends on the jurisdiction. In some jurisdictions, it really is an uncertainty problem, right? It hasn't been tested in the courts. We're not sure. No one's done the analysis, or we've done the analysis and it's not clear. The third one is over and under inclusiveness. And this is, I think, largely the biggest problem, right? So this is where we look at the existing laws and they're under inclusive. They don't capture whatever people are doing now. So they don't cover the new scenario adequately, or parts of it don't cover the new scenario. So we're not getting the benefit of what the current law did to protect that value because it's just outside its scope, right? A good example of this comes up in the laws that were done around sperm donation, actually, around the world. So when sperm donation became possible, there was a lot of regulation of sperm donation. Health checks had to be done, genetic checks maybe, in the, you know, at least family histories in the technology of the time. You know, records had to be kept of who the father was in case that was a problem down the line, et cetera, et cetera. But when over donation became possible, it wasn't covered because the laws that were written used the word sperm, and so over is not sperm, and so it was outside the scope of the law. So no health checks, no genetic family histories, no record keeping initially until the laws changed. So that's an example of under-inclusiveness of the existing laws. But you can also have over-inclusiveness. Sometimes existing laws cover new conduct and it's actually not appropriate. And I can give examples of that too, but the examples I have to hand are quite Australian, if you like. So in some contexts, for example, when railways came into existence, they fell under some of the laws about common carriers, about the obligations of common carriers that couldn't be met by a fixed track railway, right? So the laws that govern common carriers were over-inclusive with respect to railways. The new technology simply couldn't meet the same requirements as coaches and horses could meet by giving a delivery direct to a specified donation, to a specified destination, and so forth. Is this making sense? Yeah. Okay, good, excellent. All right, so that's an example of over-inclusiveness. You can have over and under-inclusiveness. That was the third problem. So we've got no corresponding law, uncertainty, over and under inclusiveness. And finally, obsolescence, which is where the law that exists is no longer effective given this new technology is possible, right? So we have a law, but it just is no longer cost effective or effective even in the new world in which we live. Because these new practices are possible, the way we went about regulating to solve this particular problem no longer works, right? And a good example of that is radio spectrum. So the way we avoided initially radio spectrum interference, and in fact still do, is to say that you sell the spectrum and you say you can only broadcast in your little bit of spectrum, and so we avoid interference. Now that might sound great, but we actually have new technology. We could do this better now if we wanted to. Spread spectrum technologies would allow the two radio stations to transmit in the same range and yet not interfere with each other, right? We can't actually use those technologies as long as the law stays the way it is. So we may or may not be doing spectrum regulation as efficiently as we could given new technology, right? So that's an example of just obsolescence. It's no longer the way we would have gone about regulating airwaves if we knew this technology existed, but very few jurisdictions have changed it today. So they're my 4 problems. Okay, what then do you do? That's all step 2. So going back again, this is so much easier on a slide. Going back again, step 1 is what are your values and goals? Step 2 is how well the laws meet those, given the new technological context. And we had quite a lot of discussion about scenarios and then my 4 sort of classifications. And then next step is law reform. What do we need to do? And here is the step, I argue, that a lot of the technology regulation language skips, because they just say, well, you regulate the technology, right? If you've got a problem, you say, oh, we've got a problem, let's define something that's causing the problem and then regulate it. And what the questions I would rather people ask is, what is the best legal mechanism to solve this problem? And is technological specificity really necessary given, you know, all of the context-specific factors that can be looked at? So by taking that approach, we avoid technological specificity except where that's aligned with purpose. So we can still do it for human cloning where it is the right approach, the best approach, but we avoid doing it where it doesn't get us anywhere. We would have avoided regulating digital tapes. We would have avoided regulating nanomaterials. And we can still avoid regulating artificial intelligence. It avoids an artificial analytical gap between all the bad stuff that's happened or could happen and that people are worried about with artificial intelligence, with algorithms, with machine learning, and what's happened that causes the same sorts of problems without that technology. So if I'm using AI and machine learning as an example, we see a lot of concern about discrimination due to algorithms, due to machine learning, due to AI, that in fact can be done with good old-fashioned statistics. And that's been happening by actuaries for years without using any fancy new technologies. They readily discriminate against people on all kinds of bases in pricing insurance products based on their risk calculations, etc. We don't need machine learning to do data-driven discrimination. And if we're going to ask what needs to be done, we therefore need to think about it not just in the current technological context, what's happened last week, but in the broader historical context, in the broader context of all the ways in which the issue arises. And so we have that continuity in our analysis, right? We're not just worrying about a particular technological thing. Now, to the extent one wants to engage in the narrative about this, and I'll leave that to each of you, my approach is also pro-innovation because it doesn't pick on the technology, right? It doesn't, it says, if you're not caught, you know, you are going to be treated the same way by the law, whether you use artificial intelligence or whether you do something that causes the equivalent problem. We're not discriminating against innovation and new things. We're just trying to protect, say, fairness, right? We're just trying to protect this value and it'll apply to everybody. So in that sense, it's pro-innovation. It also requires governments to take their valued ethical and legal commitments seriously and not limit them to new technological contexts. So my example for this is an Australian one, so you'll have to forgive me. We had a terrible thing, and I'll talk about it a little bit more further on, called robo-debt. It was an automated government decision-making system that automatically sent debt letters to people who did not, in fact, owe the government money, and we had suicides as a result, because people who were very vulnerable people, who are on welfare, who need support from the state, received these letters saying they owed thousands of dollars, had no way to pay them, had no way to live without the money that they otherwise got from the government, and killed themselves, right? This is a real thing that happened in Australia. It was absolutely awful, and it's not that long ago. This is something the government was doing at the same time as it launched its AI ethics principles, right? So it said, we've now got ethical AI in Australia. Here's, you know, and they're all the same as the ones you've seen, right? Do no harm, you know, be fair, be accountable, be transparent, all the motherhood and apple pie statements, right? All the positive, wonderful things. These were all part of our AI ethics principles. And I actually asked one of the senior advisors to the minister who launched the AI ethical principles, what about robo-debt? And the answer was very simple. Robo-debt isn't AI. And they're right, it wasn't. There's no machine learning, it was automation. I think it used COBOL. Like it wasn't fancy, but it caused problems. But because it didn't fit into the technological definition that the government was protecting, it's like, yeah, that can keep going. So we don't need to worry about ethics for that. We only need to worry about ethics for AI. So this is the mindset I'm trying to change in government. And it's very easy for government to regulate AI because it thinks of it as something over there, right? Whereas we need to build in our values and protections so that they cover all the things, not just the latest technological fad. So a bit of an example, I've already talked about it a little bit, but just to sort of make sure everyone's on the same page, is discrimination and unfairness in machine learning. Let's go through what I say should happen, right? First step, what's the value we want to protect? Fairness, right? We're trying to make sure that people are treated fairly, that you don't miss out on a job because you're a woman or because you're Black, right? We want to make sure that there is fairness in particular context of social life, right? Employment's one, accommodations another, etc. Okay, so what is the problem? Well, you've heard about some of these, just to float a few. Data used to train a machine learning model can have biases, right? So if you use a crime database, for example, to build a prediction model for crime, which you're going to use, you have your police use, that's going to be biased to how police record crime. And they tend to record more serious offences when it's a Black person compared to a white person and so forth. So the database on which you're drawing your training data has biases in it. You might choose a machine learning model that reduces the prevalence of outliers and the way the model functions. And that might mean that particular people are left out of the analysis and therefore not included, and you have exclusions and so forth from machine learning. You might ignore particular categories as a result of this kind of thing. You might use variables that are problematic, right? Or more commonly, you might use variables that correlate with those variables, right? In a way that would not be considered appropriate in real life, even if statistically relevant. So it doesn't matter, for example, in real life, that a particular racial group might be better or worse at a particular job description on average, I'm still not allowed to discriminate. Whereas in machine learning models, correlates for the relevant variable in that circumstance would get picked up and used by the training, used in the training, and it would become recognized. So even though under discrimination law, we couldn't discriminate, if you like, even if the bias is true, we can once we just throw a model on a set of data. So these are the kinds of problems that we get in machine learning. And in many cases, in many jurisdictions, discrimination law won't solve the problem anymore, because discrimination law is designed to catch the racist or sexist boss, not these kinds of systems. And that's based on the way that they're worded and the kinds of things that they focus on, as well as the mechanisms of giving evidence and so forth in those kinds of cases. So there are many reasons why it doesn't work, and I don't want to get into the specifics of one law's discrimination law because it wouldn't be German anyway. But in lots of jurisdictions, discrimination law doesn't work as well as it used to. Often because of uncertainty. People simply don't know whether it's applied. Sometimes because of under-inclusiveness, that the way the law works at the moment it does not cover the new kinds of conduct. Okay, so what do we want to do? Well, do we want to regulate machine learning? I argue no, because again, we can do the same thing with good old-fashioned statistics. So it's a problem that's become more prevalent in the context of machine learning. There's a scale issue with machine learning, but it's not because you're doing that particular technique that we have a problem. Therefore, we need a technology neutral approach to our law reform. And what we need to do is go back to discrimination law and rewrite it so that it works not only for the racist boss, but also for the use of these kinds of systems in unfair ways. And again, no time to go through the detail of that for a particular jurisdiction, but hopefully you sort of get the idea of what I'm arguing. So in this body of technologies we're talking about, automation, algorithms, bots, machine learning, AI, what have you, when I'm doing my analysis, tend to find two clusters of problems that are worth dealing with. One cluster of problems is around the automation element. So the fact that the process is running along all by itself. These are the words like automation, algorithms, and bots. But I wouldn't regulate automation, algorithms, and bots. Instead, I'd think about what we need to do for accountability in a context where the decision maker may be a human or maybe a system. What kinds of reasons for decision should we demand, right? Where we don't know how that decision's made, what combination of human and system, right? So we rethink how we draft our administrative law, for example, around what's required in reasons for decision so that the language used applies well and gives us exactly what we want either way. That's just one example, right? There's other things we need to do, but that's just sort of one problem. The other cluster of problems is around machine learning and AI, and in particular, data-driven decision-making. And that's where we need to fix laws like discrimination laws, et cetera, right? And privacy laws, data protection laws. That is all related to the sort of mass use of data in a particular way. But as I said, we can do that without talking about machine learning or defining AI. We can do that simply by improving the laws that are meant to protect the relevant values, data protection laws, fairness laws, and so forth, discrimination laws. So here's where I really want my slides. So I'm really annoyed at my computer at the moment because I did want to show you this very visually in the context of the European Draft AI Act, right? And I wanted to give you a specific example of where I see this kind of technology-specific, needlessly technology-specific law. So this is one of the, as you all would know, there are certain practices that are prohibited and then others that are regulated as high-risk systems. This is one of the prohibited practices, and I'm going to read it to you. The placing on the market, putting into service or use of an AI system that deploys subliminal techniques beyond a person's consciousness in order to materially distort a person's behavior in a manner that causes or is likely to cause that person or another person physical or psychological harm, right? So it's an AI system that does subliminal advertising to manipulate people, right, in brief. But let me read you that same provision, leaving out the words AI system, right? Why shouldn't we prohibit, quote, the placing on the market, putting into service or use of any system, or you know, anything really, that deploys subliminal techniques beyond the person's consciousness in order to materially distort a person's behavior in a manner that causes or is likely to cause that person or another person physical or psychological harm. In other words, I see exactly the same problem with the conduct, whether it's caused by an AI system or whether it's caused by, you know, some kind of crazy, evil, manipulative goblin, right? It doesn't matter, right? What you're doing, how you're doing it, you are using subliminal techniques to manipulate people in ways that cause harm. Please don't do that. So why don't we just leave AI out? Why is it a regulation of AI and not just we're prohibiting this thing that is awful, right? So why? There's a really practical answer to that, because I did ask someone from the European Commission who was on the drafting team. And the answer is, and you might recognize this kind of problem because it happens everywhere, but Europe probably particularly because it's so large and complex, that's what we were told to do. Our task as the European Commission was to draft a regulation of AI. So that's the thing we were tasked with doing. That's what we had to do. And we captured all the conduct we didn't like and you know, that was linked in some way to AI systems, and prohibited the really bad stuff, and then regulated the could be bad stuff. And that's what we did, right? We did what we were told. So my point isn't that they did that task badly, although that can be argued. The point is they were given the wrong task, right? The define and regulate solution to the problems generated by new technology is the wrong one. Now we can see some of the tensions in this already in the dispute about things like, how do you even define AI? And I have sat on through Standards Australia on the ISO standards body for artificial intelligence, and those people have been arguing about the definition of AI for like 5 years now, right? And these are all experts. There is no good definition, actually. The challenge is to define AI as something broad enough to capture expert systems, machine learning, all the different techniques used, but narrow enough that ordinary calculators are not AI, right? That we, you know, because that's old technology, that's not AI. And it's really hard to do, right? It's really hard to draw that line so that you've got a clear line where the stuff you're worried about is on one side, because it kind of depends on what you're worried about too, and the stuff that we don't want to include in whatever the law is on the other side. And like I said, standards bodies have been working on this problem for years. Europe is now working on the problem and has already changed its proposed definition once, and needs to use all sorts of additional mechanisms so it can change it over time, appendices and what have you. It's just a mess, because the problem isn't the technology. The problem isn't actually particular techniques. So it's really hard to define the problem through a definition of technology, right? The problem is the automation related problems and the data-driven decision-making related problems, but trying to put all of those problems together into a package called AI in one regulation, I can't see it working no matter what definition they pick. They can go broad, they can go narrow, both have problems. Because remember, over-inclusiveness can be as much of a problem as under-inclusiveness, and it's not the right regulatory object. So no matter how long you stare at the definition and rework it, I can't see it working at all. What else am I going to say? Okay, so what I'm really arguing here is, let's not create rules for AI, let's work out the problems and let's fix the laws that need to be fixed. So in this issue, I should say I picked one section of the Act. I've read the whole Act, and I see this throughout. Why do you only want to regulate high-risk activities that relate to AI? What about, if you want to have a risk-based regulation and you want to regulate anything that's high risk, why limit that to high risk generated through an AI system, as opposed to come up with something that monitors risk in, you know, corporations of a certain size or what have you? It doesn't make sense to me. I can't see any reason to link risk to technology. There are many things that might cause risk. AI systems are one, but other things are too. I can't see that as making any sense. So why does this matter? Why am I arguing against something that otherwise looks so pretty, like the AI Act? History demonstrates, and I've used a few examples at the beginning of my talk, that when you tie legislation to a particular technological object or practice, it becomes obsolete. Almost always. We think we know what we're talking about in 2023, but we don't even know what's next. And something will happen that will be, we want to regulate for exactly the same reasons, and it's not going to be within the definition. We'll start to capture things that we don't know exist yet, because we've got a very broad definition and it doesn't really apply to that new thing, right? So either way, I don't really care, we've got a problem. So the other problem with this kind of thing is organizations will do inefficient things to avoid the regulation. So everyone now is doing AI. It sounds good in marketing. I've gone to law tech conferences And like every single software used by lawyers is now described as AI powered, right? AI is everywhere. And you ask them, what is your AI? And like, it is not really AI in any meaningful sense. It is software. Software is good. Everyone needs software, but AI is just a magic fairy word that marketers use. If you have an AI Act, you'll see that flip. That could be a good thing, right? People will stop saying they're using AI, but people will also work around it, right? We're not using AI. We're using a very complex statistical model, right? We're not using AI. We have a human loop, whatever, right? They will find ways to get around whatever the regulation is. And how they get around it depends on how you define it, but there will be a way around it using future techniques or even using current ones. And it's inefficient from the perspective of industry, and it means the regulation's not going to be able to do its work as well. Better, and this is my pro-innovation line, to work out what the problem is and solve it without referring to the technology. So you're not actually regulating a particular technological practice, you're regulating to fix the problem. So for AI, as I've already said, the real problems are either around that automation cluster of problems or the data-driven cluster of problems. Now I can keep going, but I think I'm roughly at time, so I'll go quickly, but just to flag a few things. One is, this is also a problem in the GDPR, in fact, in relation to Article 22 and the related articles that sit on top of that, so 13, 14, 15, because it says that a subject has a right not to be subject to a decision based solely on automated processing, et cetera, which produces legal effects, blah, blah, blah. And ultimately, if you go through all the different sections, what you get is not that we can't use computers. What you get is that people have to be given meaningful information about the logic involved, et cetera, et cetera. But this is essentially about transparency, right? That when you use these kinds of automated systems, there's a degree of transparency you need to have if people are going to be affected by it. But we can do all of that without talking about solely on automated processing. We can actually have requirements about decision-making that talk about transparency that don't limit themselves to solely on automated processing. And that has two advantages. One is it captures the kind of like human in the loop rubber stamp problem. Oh, it's not solely automated processing, we have a human. So you capture that and you extend it that way, but you even go further. You can actually say, we want organizations to be transparent about the way they make certain kinds of decisions, even if it's humans. Because often humans are simply following an automated set of instructions. You ever talk to those humans who help you on the phone when you've got a problem with an organization? They're just following script sheets with trees, right? Now you can have a system do that, you can have a human do that. You can say if it's important, right? And not all automated or human, helplines are important. But if they really do have a legal effect where you get to at the end, we can demand that be transparent too. There's no reason, if a human is essentially the automaton in the process, there's no reason why we shouldn't be demanding transparency about how they make their decisions. What's their flowchart, right? Why not? Same, really, you could program it in the same thing just as easily into a computer. So again, leave aside the technology, what's actually you trying to fix? Unless you think I'm picking on Europe, I had an example from Australia, those wonderful AI ethical principles I talked about earlier, exactly the same problem. So I'll give you an example of one. Throughout their life cycle, AI systems should benefit individuals, society, and the environment. Okay, that's good, right? AI systems should benefit, they should be good, right? Here's what's interesting. The government that was in power at the time that created these AI ethical principles was the most environmentally destructive government Australia's had. They approved mines everywhere. They actually repealed our emissions trading tax, right? Our emissions trading scheme, our carbon tax. They repealed that. They were environmentally destructive, right? They were terrible. That every single law they passed almost was designed to free up fossil fuel companies to do more harm. And yet they can sit down with a straight face and say that AI systems should all benefit the environment. Really? Not governments, not organizations, just AI systems. I mean, it highlights what I talked about, the political problem here, which is that it's very easy to regulate something that looks like a fancy new tech. and very hard to be serious about the values that we care about, environmental values, privacy, fairness, and actually write your laws in a way that really are honest and do protect those values and goals, right? It's much easier to point at the technology politically. So to wrap up, framing the question again, I wish I had my slide here so you could see it, but I'll read it. Here's my question that I ask, right, about new technology. Given our existing legal and regulatory frameworks, what changes are required to respond to the unique considerations raised by new activities, entities, and relationships associated with new technological practices, if you like, right? So what needs to change, right? That depends. There's no one answer. It's not always the case that you change, say, the existing act like discrimination law. It's not always the case that you regulate the technology specifically. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other, sometimes it's something else entirely, like a brand new law, but that regulates beyond the technology. It could be anything. And you can't answer that question in general. You have to be specific. But what you can do is engage the brain in between identifying all the things you're worried about, right? All the things that are wrong, and regulating the technology. That's it. Thank you.
So, Lyria, thank you so much for this great talk and for the energy that came across. I'm really impressed, not only by the content but also by the energy. I think it's 6 now. It's close to 7 your time.
Close to 7 now.
But again, I'm impressed. At that time, I would need a lot of coffees to get onto that level of energy. Again, thank you so much for this talk, and also for bringing in the European examples. The time difference already indicates that seemingly there is a great distance between our worlds or continents, but you quite nicely illustrated or showed that in terms of the content and what we face, there is not. So again, this was great.